Have you ever wondered how far a person could go when pushed to the edge of desperation? Imagine a couple whose marriage is falling apart, seeking help from a renowned therapist. But what if this retreat, meant to heal broken relationships, ends in tragedy? This is the chilling story of a couple's therapy retreat that turned deadly, revealing dark secrets and a betrayal that no one could have predicted. Sebastian Thompson had it all. At 45 years old, he was a successful businessman in the heart of California. His career was thriving, but behind the polished exterior of his professional life, his marriage to Hazel was deteriorating. Hazel, his wife of 15 years, was feeling suffocated. Once a devoted homemaker, she had put her own dreams on hold to support Sebastian's ambitions. But as the years passed, the love that once seemed unbreakable was replaced with silence and resentment. Hazel's yearning for freedom, her desire to find herself again, grew stronger with each passing day. One quiet autumn morning, after months of arguing and growing apart, Sebastian suggested they try something drastic to save their marriage, a therapy retreat. The idea was simple. They would leave behind the pressures of daily life and go to a secluded, peaceful retreat in Napa Valley, California. It was a perfect setting, beautiful vineyards, rolling hills, and the kind of tranquility they thought would heal their fractured bond. Little did they know, it would lead them down a much darker path. The retreat was run by Dr. David Green, a renowned therapist with a reputation for saving struggling marriages. Dr. Green was charismatic, empathetic, and seemingly the perfect man to help them rediscover what they had lost. At first, the sessions felt promising. Sebastian and Hazel opened up, sharing their frustrations and fears. They both wanted to fix their marriage, but the more they tried, the further apart they seemed to drift. Dr. Green noticed the tension between them, and while he seemed to offer solutions, there was something unsettling in the way he singled Hazel out during their private sessions. He listened to her with such intensity, his eyes lingering just a bit too long, making her feel understood in ways Sebastian never had. Hazel, vulnerable and desperate for connection, began to rely on Dr. Green more than she realized. As the days went on, Sebastian noticed the growing closeness between his wife and the therapist. Hazel seemed distant, withdrawn, and her conversations with Dr. Green appeared more frequent. Sebastian tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was just part of the healing process. But his gut told him something was wrong. His suspicions began to gnaw at him, and the more he watched, the more convinced he became that Dr. Green was crossing professional boundaries. What started as a therapeutic relationship quickly spiraled into something much darker. Dr. Green, aware of Hazel's emotional fragility, began to manipulate her thoughts. He painted Sebastian as the villain, subtly planting seeds of doubt in her mind. He played on her fears, making her feel trapped in her marriage, convincing her that she deserved more. Hazel's growing dependence on Dr. Green's approval became evident, but she couldn't see it. She felt understood for the first time in years, and that sense of validation was intoxicating. But as Hazel grew closer to Dr. Green, her marriage to Sebastian continued to fall apart. The retreat, which was meant to bring them back together, only served to deepen the divide. Their private sessions with Dr. Green became the focal point of Hazel's existence, and she began to pull away from Sebastian more and more. Sebastian, frustrated and confused, felt like he was losing the woman he once loved. Every attempt to reach her seemed to fail. The more he tried to control the situation, the more she pulled away. He was losing her to someone else, and he had no idea what to do about it. One evening, after a particularly heated session, Hazel returned to their cabin, emotionally drained. Sebastian was waiting for her, desperate to understand what was happening to their relationship. In a fit of frustration, he lashed out, accusing her of already giving up on their marriage. Hazel, torn between her guilt and her growing attachment to Dr. Green, didn't respond the way he wanted. Instead, she turned to Dr. Green for comfort. This small moment was the breaking point. Sebastian, feeling completely powerless, stormed out of the cabin. The night was still and cold, and as he wandered through the retreat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, Hazel, lost in her own emotional chaos, went to find Dr. Green. What followed was a tragedy none of them could have predicted. That night, the retreat's peaceful surroundings were shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Other guests rushed from their cabins, panic in their eyes, to find the source of the scream. It came from Sebastian and Hazel's cabin. Inside, they found Sebastian lying lifeless on the floor, his eyes wide open in shock, his body showing signs of a violent struggle. Hazel stood over him, pale and trembling, her mind unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. She kept muttering that she didn't know how it happened, that she had woken up to find him like that. Dr. Green, ever the calm and composed figure, quickly took charge. He directed the others to stay back as he entered the cabin and reassured everyone that he would handle the situation. Within minutes, the police and paramedics arrived, and the retreat, once a place of healing, was now a crime scene. The initial investigation pointed to foul play. Sebastian's injuries and the signs of struggle suggested a violent confrontation. Hazel, as the only other person in the room, was taken into custody for questioning. Her fragile emotional state made the interrogation more complicated, and the investigators struggled to get clear answers from her. Dr. Green, ever the supportive figure, continued to vouch for Hazel. He told the police that she had been under immense stress and that Sebastian's controlling behavior had driven her to act out in self-defense. At first, the police seemed to buy his story. But as the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies began to surface. Detective Sarah Collins, determined to get to the truth, dug deeper. As she interviewed more witnesses and analyzed the evidence, the tangled web of lies and manipulation began to unravel. The affair between Hazel and Dr. Green, hidden from everyone but the two of them, was the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. The investigation into Sebastian Thompson's death was unfolding at a slow, deliberate pace, but for Hazel, time seemed to stretch endlessly. She couldn't remember the events clearly, only flashes of panic and confusion. Her emotions were raw, torn between guilt and grief. The weight of Sebastian's death hung heavily on her shoulders, but in the pit of her stomach, Hazel felt a sickening sense that she was being manipulated, though she didn't know how or by whom. Dr. David Green, the therapist who had been there to help them both, was now the one offering her constant reassurance. He continued to stand by her, to be the voice of calm in the chaos of her life. His words were gentle, his gestures kind, but beneath that calm exterior, Hazel could feel a growing unease. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something unsettling in the way he watched her, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a little too long. In the midst of her distress, Hazel found herself relying on him more and more. Dr. Green told her she was under a lot of stress, that everything would be fine as long as she stayed calm. He suggested she remain at the retreat, to take a break from the police interrogation and regain her strength. Hazel agreed, wanting desperately to believe him, wanting to believe that someone, anyone, would be there to help her make sense of everything. Yet, every day that passed made Hazel feel more like a pawn in a game she couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Detective Sarah Collins had been making steady progress on the case. She had been in Napa Valley only a few days, but she already suspected something wasn't right. The signs of struggle in the cabin, the bruises on Sebastian's neck, the broken lamp, none of it added up. Hazel was the prime suspect, but something felt off about the whole situation. There were pieces missing, gaps in the story that didn't align. And then, the biggest clue came, Dr. Green's fingerprints. The detective had started digging into Dr. Green's background. It didn't take long before she uncovered his history as a therapist who had been known to cross boundaries with his patients. She found evidence that suggested Dr. Green had more than a professional interest in Hazel. The more Sarah looked into the case, the more she realized Dr. Green was far from the calm, reassuring figure he appeared to be. He was a manipulator, using his position of power to prey on vulnerable people, especially women like Hazel. Hazel, meanwhile, was growing increasingly dependent on Dr. Green. What began as a professional relationship had slowly turned into something much more dangerous. She confided in him about her frustrations with Sebastian, her feelings of being trapped, unheard, and unappreciated. Dr. Green listened with a kind, patient ear. But the more Hazel talked, the more she felt a strange shift within her. He was no longer just a therapist, he was someone who seemed to understand her in ways Sebastian never had. And the more he reassured her that Sebastian's controlling behavior was the cause of all her suffering, the more Hazel believed it. In one of their private sessions, Dr. Green suggested that Hazel deserved more than she was getting in her marriage. He spoke with such conviction, painting a picture of a future where she could be free from Sebastian's grip, free to explore her own desires and emotions. Hazel, still feeling the sting of years spent in a suffocating marriage, found herself drawn to his words. He told her that sometimes, when someone is as controlling as Sebastian, drastic measures are needed. What started as a small seed of doubt in Hazel's mind soon grew into something darker. She was becoming more distant from Sebastian, and in the rare moments when they were together, the tension between them was unbearable. Sebastian's suspicions about her relationship with Dr. Green continued to grow. He noticed how Hazel's demeanor had changed, how she seemed to shrink away from him more and more. One evening, Sebastian confronted Hazel. He was desperate, his frustration boiling over after days of feeling shut out and ignored. His voice cracked as he asked, "What's happening to us, Hazel? What's really going on?" Hazel froze, unable to look him in the eye. Her mind was a whirlwind. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain her feelings, but she couldn't find the words. She felt torn between the man she had married and the man who seemed to offer her the freedom and understanding she had craved for so long. Sebastian, sensing the emotional distance, lost control. His anger flared, and in a heated argument, he lashed out. "You don't care about me anymore, do you?" he shouted. "You're slipping away, Hazel, and I don't know how to reach you." The word struck Hazel like a physical blow. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she still cared, but the truth was too complicated. She had been slipping away for months, and now, in the face of Sebastian's accusations, she felt a deep sense of guilt, mixed with a strange relief. For the first time in so long, someone, Dr. Green, had made her feel seen and valued. But she couldn't admit that to Sebastian, not when it felt like admitting defeat. "I don't know what to do anymore," Hazel whispered, her voice barely audible. It was then that Dr. Green appeared at the door, just as Hazel's mind began to spiral. He had been watching from the shadows, as he often did, waiting for just the right moment to step in. His calm, reassuring presence seemed like a lifeline, and Hazel, emotionally exhausted, turned to him as she had so many times before. "Hazel, you don't have to explain anything to him," Dr. Green said, his voice smooth and comforting. "You've been under too much pressure. Let me help you." Sebastian's face turned pale as he watched the exchange. His suspicions about Dr. Green had been growing, but now, seeing the way Hazel turned to him for support, he knew something was terribly wrong. His worst fears were coming true. He was losing Hazel, and the therapist was taking her from him. The tension in the room was palpable as Sebastian, now filled with rage and hurt, turned on Dr. Green. "Stay away from her," he warned, his voice low and threatening. But Dr. Green only smiled, the kind of smile that sent a shiver down Sebastian's spine. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Dr. Green said calmly. "Hazel needs peace, and I'm here to help her find it." That was the moment everything changed. What had started as a retreat meant to heal a marriage now felt like a war zone, with Hazel caught in the middle. She didn't realize it yet, but the path she was on was leading her to a point of no return. The air in the retreat had grown thick with tension, each passing moment pushing Hazel and Sebastian further apart. It was the fourth night of their stay in Napa Valley, and the atmosphere, once tranquil and full of promise, now felt suffocating. Hazel couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. Her heart was torn in two. Part of her wanted to hold on to her marriage, to find the love she once shared with Sebastian, but another part was drawn to the world Dr. Green had promised her, a world of freedom, of being truly seen. That night, something snapped. Sebastian had been stewing in his thoughts for days, noticing how his wife had become more withdrawn, how she looked to Dr. Green for validation instead of him. His suspicions had evolved into a deep, gnawing fear. Was his marriage really over? Was Hazel no longer the woman he had once loved, but someone else, someone lost to another man? The uncertainty consumed him. In the small cabin, where the once-loved memories of their marriage now seemed to haunt them, Sebastian finally confronted Hazel. His voice was raw, strained with emotion. "What's going on, Hazel? Why are you shutting me out? You're not the woman I married. What happened to us?" Hazel, still conflicted, could feel the weight of his words. The guilt hit her like a brick to the chest. She wanted to answer him, to explain the pain and the confusion, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, all she could do was turn her eyes away from him, unwilling to meet his gaze. Sebastian, in his frustration, stepped closer to her. "Hazel, you don't have to keep lying to me. You're not the same. And I know it's him. Dr. Green." His voice cracked with anger. "I see it. I see how you look at him. You don't need me anymore, do you?" The accusation cut through her like a blade. Hazel felt her body tense, her heart racing. How could she explain the depth of her feelings? She hadn't been lying, she had been lost, torn between her past with Sebastian and the new reality Dr. Green had offered. But she couldn't admit that. Not to him. Not now. Hazel began, but the words faltered. In an instant, Sebastian's patience evaporated. "What's it going to take, Hazel? Do I have to beg you? To fight for you? I can't do this anymore. I can't stand to watch you slip away." His anger flared, and his voice grew louder, breaking with emotion. "You've already given up, haven't you? The dam broke." All the unresolved feelings of betrayal, frustration, and hurt that had built up between them exploded in that moment. Hazel stepped back, unable to hold it together any longer. Her heart ached with confusion. She loved Sebastian, but she couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward Dr. Green. And there it was, the uncomfortable truth she had been trying to avoid. She was slipping away from her marriage, not just emotionally, but physically. Dr. Green had always been there, his words soothing her pain, his presence filling the void that had been left in her heart. But Sebastian's outburst, the final straw, pushed Hazel over the edge. It was as if she was seeing everything clearly for the first time. She couldn't keep lying to herself. She had already lost her way. In the midst of the chaos, Dr. Green appeared at the door. His calm demeanor, his ever-patient expression, only served to intensify the tension. He stepped inside without saying a word, his eyes locked onto Hazel's, as if expecting her to come to him. Sebastian, furious and desperate, turned to Dr. Green. "Stay the hell away from her," he spat, his fists clenched in frustration. But Dr. Green, ever the master of manipulation, only smiled. "I'm here to help, Sebastian. You're not seeing it clearly. Hazel needs peace, and I can give that to her." Hazel's heart raced, the words spinning in her mind. What was happening? Was she being pushed toward something that she couldn't control? Dr. Green's calmness made her feel safe, but at the same time, his presence only deepened the sense of unease she felt. "Hazel, please," Dr. Green said softly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You've been under too much pressure. Let me take care of you." Sebastian, seething with anger, couldn't take it anymore. He lunged toward Dr. Green. "You're not taking her anywhere," he shouted, his voice full of hurt and rage. The years of frustration, of feeling trapped, had culminated in this violent outburst. Sebastian was at his breaking point. Before anyone could react, Dr. Green stepped aside with ease, sidestepping Sebastian's anger. But the sudden movement seemed to trigger something in Sebastian. His mind, already clouded with rage and pain, snapped. He grabbed at the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it at Dr. Green, the force of his desperation evident in the wild motion. But Dr. Green, unfazed, managed to dodge the blow. In the split second that followed, Sebastian lost his balance and stumbled backward, crashing into a nearby chair. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud. Hazel screamed, rushing to him. But it was too late. Sebastian's body lay still, his eyes wide open in shock. The room fell silent except for the sound of Hazel's frantic breathing. Hazel's heart stopped. She couldn't process what had just happened. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse him. "Sebastian? Please, no." But there was no response. Dr. Green, still composed, stepped forward. His calm demeanor was chilling in contrast to the chaos in the room. "It's over, Hazel," he said quietly. "He was controlling you. You're free now." The words felt like a dagger to Hazel's heart. She had just witnessed the death of her husband, and yet, in that moment, part of her felt a strange sense of relief. But that relief was quickly overshadowed by the horror of what had just happened. She didn't know if it was her fault, or if it was Dr. Green's influence that had pushed Sebastian too far. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same. As the authorities arrived at the retreat, the peaceful setting that had once promised healing now became a crime scene. Hazel was taken into custody, her dazed state and fragmented memories making it difficult for anyone to understand the truth. Dr. Green, maintaining his role as a concerned therapist, assured the police that Hazel had been under immense stress, portraying her as a victim pushed to the edge. But the truth was more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation continued, secrets were revealed, and the full extent of Dr. Green's manipulation came to light. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done, and Hazel was left to piece together the broken remnants of her life. The morning after Sebastian's death, the serene beauty of Napa Valley seemed hauntingly out of place. The rolling hills, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now served as the backdrop to a crime that would shake the retreat to its core. Hazel Thompson sat in a small, dimly lit room at the local police station, still in shock. Her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The memories of that night, the heated arguments, the shattering of the lamp, and then, nothing, kept swirling in her mind. She couldn't remember what happened after Sebastian fell, and that terrified her. The only thing she was sure of was that Sebastian was dead, and she couldn't explain why. Detective Sarah Collins paced back and forth in the hallway, reviewing the notes she'd taken during her interviews. There was something off about this case, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The crime scene, the cabin where Sebastian was found, looked like it had been meticulously staged, as though someone was trying to cover their tracks. The way Sebastian's body was positioned, the lack of defensive wounds on Hazel, it all seemed too calculated. The signs of struggle pointed to a violent confrontation, but the rest of the details didn't add up. She was certain that Hazel wasn't the only one involved, but who else could it be? Sarah's gut told her that Dr. David Green, the retreat's therapist, was key to understanding what had happened. The more she dug into Dr. Green's background, the more suspicious he became. He was well respected in his field, known for his ability to help couples in crisis, but there were whispers about his previous relationships with vulnerable patients. His charm, his ability to make people feel understood, was not just his strength, it was his weapon. As Sarah reviewed the retreat's guest list, she saw that there were a few inconsistencies. Dr. Green had been particularly close to Hazel, but more troubling was the fact that he had been seen entering the cabin the night before Sebastian's death. Why hadn't he mentioned that? Sarah's instincts were sharp, and they told her that something was being hidden. Meanwhile, Hazel sat in a sterile interrogation room, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. She wanted to be truthful, to explain what had happened, but every time she tried to recall the events of that night, her mind seemed to betray her. She could see flashes, Sebastian's angry face, Dr. Green's calm presence, but the details were foggy. Hazel was certain she hadn't killed Sebastian, but she had no memory of what had happened after the fight. Was she capable of something like this? Or had someone pushed her to the edge? And who was that person? The pressure of the investigation weighed heavily on Hazel. The police weren't convinced by her story. Detective Collins had noted the inconsistencies in her statements, and the more Hazel tried to explain, the more her words seemed to fall apart. In her mind, the truth seemed to slip further away with each passing moment. The room felt suffocating as she clung to the hope that Dr. Green would come to her rescue, just as he had before. But Sarah Collins wasn't the only one suspicious of Dr. Green. As the investigation deepened, more and more guests from the retreat began to speak up. Some of them had noticed the increasingly inappropriate relationship between Dr. Green and Hazel. He had been isolating her from the others, giving her more attention than was necessary for a therapist. One guest, Rachel, revealed that she had overheard a heated argument between Hazel and Dr. Green just a few days before Sebastian's death. The argument had been about a private matter, one that Rachel couldn't fully hear, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Was Dr. Green emotionally manipulating Hazel to the point where she was willing to go to extremes? With these new revelations, Sarah felt a surge of determination. She requested a search of Dr. Green's personal belongings, including his office and his financial records. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Large sums of money had been transferred from Hazel's account to an offshore account linked to Dr. Green. The evidence pointed to one thing: Dr. Green had been exploiting Hazel, and possibly others, for financial gain. But it wasn't just the money that bothered Sarah. It was the manipulation. The way Dr. Green had played on Hazel's emotions, subtly pushing her toward a breaking point, was chilling. Sarah couldn't understand why anyone would do this, why someone would destroy the trust and well-being of a vulnerable person for their own benefit. The more Sarah dug, the more she realized that Dr. Green wasn't just a manipulative therapist, he was a predator. In the midst of the investigation, Hazel's memory began to return, but with it came more terrifying questions. She started to remember more vivid flashes from the night of Sebastian's death. She could recall Dr. Green speaking softly to her in the cabin, his voice lulling her into a sense of calm, just like in their private sessions. She remembered him telling her that she deserved to be free, that she needed to escape from Sebastian's control. But Hazel couldn't remember what happened after that. Did she fall into a trance, as Dr. Green often suggested during their sessions? Or had she been coerced into doing something she didn't want to do? The deeper Hazel's memories went, the more terrified she became. She had trusted Dr. Green. He had made her feel safe when Sebastian's controlling behavior had made her feel trapped. But now, Hazel realized, she had been led into a dangerous game. Dr. Green had carefully constructed a web of lies and manipulation, and Hazel had walked right into it. Her once secure world had been shattered, and now she was left with the unbearable truth: she had been used, not just by Dr. Green, but by the very man she had trusted to help her. One afternoon, while Sarah was reviewing the evidence, a breakthrough came. A forensic report revealed a surprising detail: the broken lamp found at the crime scene had an unidentified fingerprint. As the lab ran a comparison, Sarah's heart raced. The fingerprint was a match to none other than Dr. Green. He had been there. He had been part of the violence, even if he hadn't physically struck Sebastian. But his presence, his manipulative influence over Hazel, had ultimately led to Sebastian's tragic death. With this critical evidence in hand, Sarah gathered her team and prepared to confront Dr. Green. She knew this was the turning point, but she also knew how dangerous he was. The web he had spun was intricate, but Sarah was determined to unravel it. Dr. Green's calm demeanor was no longer fooling anyone. The evidence was stacking up, and the truth was about to be exposed. As Sarah walked into Dr. Green's office, she knew the final confrontation was at hand. Hazel's future, and the truth about Sebastian's death, rested in her hands. But would the truth set Hazel free, or would it bury her even deeper in the web of lies Dr. Green had woven? The tension in the air was palpable. Detective Sarah Collins had everything she needed to confront Dr. David Green. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, each clue revealing the darker side of the seemingly calm and collected therapist. Yet as she stood outside his office, holding the final piece of evidence, Dr. Green's fingerprints on the broken lamp, Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had the truth, but she wasn't sure if Hazel, the woman who had been manipulated so expertly, was ready to face it. Sarah knocked on the door, her pulse quickening. She stepped inside, finding Dr. Green sitting behind his desk, looking completely at ease, almost as if he had been expecting this moment all along. His eyes glinted with that unsettling calmness that had made him so charismatic, and so dangerous. But Sarah could see through it now. He was cornered. "Detective Collins," Dr. Green said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "I'm glad you're here. I trust you found the answers you were looking for." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a folder on the desk in front of him, opening it to reveal the forensic report, the damning evidence that tied him to the scene of Sebastian's death. Dr. Green's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure. His calm demeanor was starting to crack. "You've been very thorough, haven't you?" he said, folding his hands together, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I assure you, this is all a misunderstanding." Sarah leaned in, her voice steady and cold. "A misunderstanding? You had a hand in Sebastian Thompson's death, Dr. Green. Your fingerprints were found on the broken lamp, and there's financial evidence showing you've been manipulating Hazel for months. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is murder." Dr. Green's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps? For the first time, he wasn't in control. Sarah had taken that away from him, piece by piece. "You don't understand," Dr. Green said quietly, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Hazel needed me. She was falling apart, and I was the only one who could help her. Sebastian was suffocating her. I only wanted to free her." Sarah's jaw tightened as she stared at him. It was a familiar justification, the manipulator trying to paint themselves as the hero of the story. By manipulating her emotions? By planting doubt in her mind? By making her feel like her only way out was through you? Sarah's voice grew more pointed. "You didn't want to help her. You wanted to control her. And you went too far." Dr. Green's calmness began to crack as Sarah's words sank in. He stood up suddenly, his voice rising with frustration. "You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to be in that position. She was trapped in a life she didn't choose. I helped her see the truth. I helped her break free. But at what cost?" Sarah fired back. "You manipulated her to the point of murder. You controlled her, Dr. Green, and now you're trying to justify it." For the first time, Dr. Green's mask slipped entirely. He let out a bitter laugh, a sound full of rage and desperation. "You think this is about money? Or power? It's not. It's about freedom. Hazel deserved more than what she had. Sebastian was controlling her, just like you're trying to control me now. You have no idea what it's like to be powerless." His outburst left a heavy silence in the room. Dr. Green's carefully crafted facade had shattered, revealing a man desperate to justify his actions. But Sarah wasn't moved by his words anymore. The truth was clear, Dr. Green had used his position as a therapist to exploit Hazel's vulnerability, to twist her emotions until she was convinced that she needed him, that Sebastian was the enemy. And when it seemed like Hazel might finally break free, he pushed her to the point of no return. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had one more card to play. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice unwavering. "Hazel did need help. But it wasn't from you. It was from someone who could see her for who she truly was, someone who didn't use her pain to their advantage." Dr. Green's expression faltered, but before he could respond, Sarah turned toward the door. "You're done, Dr. Green. The truth is out, and you're going to pay for what you've done." As Sarah walked out of his office, she felt a heavy weight lift off her shoulders. The truth had been exposed, and Dr. Green would finally face justice. But there was still the matter of Hazel. What would happen to her now? How could she reconcile the truth of what had happened, the betrayal, the manipulation? Hazel was sitting in a small room at the retreat when Sarah arrived. The interrogation had taken its toll on her. She was pale, her eyes hollow from the sleepless nights and the confusion that had consumed her for days. She had known, deep down, that something wasn't right, but the fear and the emotional chaos had clouded her judgment. When Sarah entered, Hazel looked up, her expression blank. She seemed lost, as if she had been disconnected from everything, even herself. Sarah took a deep breath and sat down across from her. "Hazel," Sarah said gently, "I need you to listen to me. Dr. Green is responsible for everything that happened. He manipulated you. He made you believe that you were trapped, that your only way out was through him. But none of that was true." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes, but she didn't speak. The weight of everything that had happened was too much for her to process in that moment. Sarah continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're not to blame for what happened, Hazel. You were taken advantage of, and now you need to take back control of your life." Hazel's breath hitched, and she whispered, I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I never wanted Sebastian to die." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on hers. "I know. And you don't need to carry that burden. Dr. Green used you, and you were caught in a trap. But you're free now, Hazel. The truth is out." A heavy silence filled the room as Hazel slowly nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. She had been manipulated, but the pain of losing Sebastian, the pain of not knowing what had truly happened that night, would stay with her for a long time. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in days, Hazel felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The truth had been unveiled, and now, she could begin to rebuild her life. The courtroom was quiet. The air heavy with anticipation as the final verdict loomed. Dr. David Green, the once charming therapist who had weaved his web of manipulation so carefully, sat at the defendant's table, his face stone cold, betraying no emotion. Hazel Thompson, the woman he had twisted into his own version of freedom, sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She was a shadow of the woman she had once been, her face pale, eyes tired, but there was something new in her expression, a flicker of determination, a glimmer of hope. As the jury filed into the room, the tension was almost unbearable. Hazel's heart pounded in her chest as she awaited the decision that would change everything. She had endured so much, first the suffocating grip of her marriage to Sebastian, then the toxic influence of Dr. Green, and now, at last, justice was within reach. The judge's voice cut through the silence, his words clear and unyielding. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. David Green, guilty of first-degree murder and financial exploitation." The words echoed in Hazel's mind, ringing with a finality that made her breath catch in her throat. Guilty. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Hazel's hands trembled, but she could barely comprehend the relief flooding through her. Dr. Green, the man who had made her feel seen, loved, and then abandoned, was finally being held accountable for his actions. He would no longer have the power to manipulate her or anyone else. But even in this moment of victory, Hazel couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that clung to her. Was it too late? Could she ever truly move on from the destruction he had caused? Could she rebuild the life that she had sacrificed so much for, or was she destined to carry the scars of her past forever? Later, when the courtroom cleared and Hazel was left standing alone in the hallway, she let out a long breath. It was as if the weight of the past few months had been lifted from her shoulders. She could feel the cool air on her skin, a symbol of the freedom that had once felt so distant. She had made it through, but the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Was freedom enough? She had the chance to rebuild, but what about all the years that had been stolen from her? Would she ever be able to forgive herself for what happened to Sebastian, for being so easily manipulated? As she walked out into the open air, her mind wandered back to the retreat. The beautiful, tranquil place that had promised healing but had instead delivered destruction. She remembered the days spent there, the conversations with Dr. Green that had seemed so innocent at first, the moments when he made her feel understood. But then, she remembered the lies, the manipulation, and the subtle way he had turned her against everything she had ever known. The man she thought could save her had been the one to destroy her. Days turned into weeks, and Hazel began the slow process of rebuilding. She started attending therapy herself, no longer under Dr. Green's influence, but seeking real help, help that would allow her to confront the trauma, the guilt, and the confusion she still carried. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like an uphill battle. The memories of her marriage to Sebastian, the conflict that had torn them apart, were still painful to recall. But through the pain, Hazel began to understand something fundamental. Healing didn't come from someone else's approval. It didn't come from a therapist who only cared about controlling her. It came from within her, the strength to face the truth and take responsibility for her own happiness. In time, Hazel found peace. She learned to forgive herself, not for Sebastian's death, because that wasn't hers to forgive, but for allowing herself to be manipulated. She forgave herself for the years she had wasted, trying to live up to someone else's expectations, someone else's needs. She learned to live for herself again. As Hazel stood at the edge of a new chapter in her life, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Was it worth it? The pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal, was it all necessary for her to learn what she had learned about herself? About what truly mattered in life? The question still lingered in her mind, unanswered but not as important as they once seemed. What mattered now was that she was free. Free to choose her own path. Free to heal. But even as she walked away from her past, Hazel knew she couldn't forget the lessons she had learned. There would always be a part of her that carried the weight of her experiences, but that was okay. It wasn't the weight that defined her, it was how she carried it. And now, Hazel was ready to carry it with strength. What about you? What do you think of Hazel's journey? Do you think she made the right choices along the way? How would you handle such a situation, caught between love, betrayal, and manipulation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story made you feel. And if you've ever had to find your way back from a difficult place, we want to know how you did it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes, sharing our stories is the first step to healing.